welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, your friendly neighborhood library aide and medievalist and podcast co-host, and I'm here with one of my very favorite authors who is writing today, and I cannot wait to dig into this book. May I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, my name is Nicola Griffith, and I'm the author of Spear, which is coming out on Tuesday, the 19th of April, so it's probably already out by the time you hear this. Spear it's a short novel, and it's a queer Arthurian retelling set in 6th century Wales. And it's a story of magic and mystery and love and lust and fights to the death, but also a story of a woman finding herself and a place to call home.
Thank you. So I am a huge fan of Hild, and I was a huge fan of this book as well. And I usually like to start with a broad question. And I was wondering, what draws you to the Middle Ages generally as a setting for fiction?
Two things, really. For me, it's a form of time travel. I get to go. It began with trying to work out what the world would have been like where I was born and brought up, before there were things like planes and contrails in the sky and the stink of car exhaust and roads everywhere. When I imagined there would be more trees, more birds, more of the things I really liked. I'm a big nature fan. There's nothing I like better than getting out under the trees. So that's one thing that appeals to me. And the other thing that really appeals to me as a writer is I get to retell the story of that time in ways that make more sense to me. I certainly grew up, and I think many people did, with this notion of the early Middle Ages being really a really brutal time, a really hard and brutal time, all grim. Everyone was mud-colored. Everything was mud-colored. People had bad teeth, and women died when they were 20, and that was it. That was your lot. That was life. And I just, I don't think human beings have changed much in the last 50,000 years. So if we have joy now, we would have had joy then. If there were queer people now, there were queer people then. If women were real human beings now, they're going to be real human beings then. And so I wanted to go back to that time and tell it like how I thought it really was, as opposed to this very bad story we've all grown up with.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are so many misconceptions about the early medieval period, and I know so many medieval historians who just sort of rankle at the term Dark Ages, and I feel like that's something that people have been fighting for a long time. I am particularly interested in the fact that you are interested in these protagonists who chafe against traditional gender norms of their time and of other times, and who live rather extraordinary lives for their times and for ours. What kind of protagonists appeal to you generally, and who do you find yourself being drawn to writing about?
I think it might be easier if I approach this from saying what I don't like reading or writing about. I don't like reading or spending any time with stress, angst, tension. I don't mind fear and rage and sadness. I love joy. I love physical joy, particularly. But I just can't be doing with these books where people feel trapped and claustrophobic and they have all this what I think of as rich people's angst about things. I mean, this does not interest me, particularly when it's about women. I'm so tired of being raised to think of women as trapped in the domestic sphere.
Mm.
So I want to write about something completely different. I want to write about big, strong, smart, able women. And by able, I mean able to determine their own destiny. They have their own agency, is probably a better way to put it. And I tend to write women who are very physically capable, quite smart, but not always firmly embedded in their culture. They're on the edges, on the periphery, partly because that's how they grew up and they have to be. But honestly, I think a lot of my people are like that because it's kind of how I am too. I like to be in the margin. I like to observe and then interact when I want, and then just disappear back into the twilight edges, the liminal spaces, if you like. Am I answering your question?
Absolutely. You've answered it fascinatingly. And I think that your approach is really vital and important, especially for writing about queer characters, because there are so many stories that end in misery and tragedy and that are so focused on trauma and, negative experiences. And I think that it's really important to read about queer joy too,
disabled joy, queer joy, women's joy, poor people's joy, just not this straight, white, privileged, non-disabled boy joy, which is what we get a lot in particularly Arthurian retellings. I mean, it's all about your manly men with the swords and the shields going out to make a name for themselves. And I just thought, that past belongs to me too. I want it. So that's what Spear was about for me, really.
That's great. Yeah, I love the protagonist of Spear, and I also love the protagonist of Hild. And I am very interested, and I hope you don't mind another question about Hild. But since I trained as a medievalist, I'm a little bit of a Latin nerd, although it's become very rusty in disuse over the past year or so. And I'm especially fascinated by the use of the term, and forgive me if my pronunciation is terrible, but gemeke or
Yamachi.
yeah, okay, yes, which is the name of your blog as well. And I know it features heavily in Hild. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this word and what it means to your stories and to Hild in particular, and why it's something that you return to, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Let me back up a little bit in that story. I did a lot of research for Hild. I researched jewelry, flora, fauna, building techniques, textile history, etc. And late in the process, I came across this factoid, which was that 65% of a woman's time in, let's say, the early 7th century was occupied by textile production. They did that all the time while they were doing all their other things. So while they were doing childcare, they were spinning. While they were stirring the pot, they were, I don't know, sorting out the flax or whatever. It was just this constant work of creating the technology of the time. I mean, without textiles, they couldn't carry food, they couldn't stay warm, etc., etc. It was a vital technology to the time, and it was basically women's work. And so it occurred to me that if women's job was all about textiles, so much of it would work better in pairs. And so I thought, there would probably be some kind of particularly in the aristocratic realm, the rich people's realm, some kind of formal relationship, like two women who formed we are going to be the people who stick together through thick. We'll watch each other's kids. We'll do our tablet weaving together because that takes two. We will always look out for each other in this way. And so I needed to find a word for that relationship. And so I came across this Old English word that basically means mate, pair, friend. It's this real mix of things. And I thought, that's my word. I'm going to turn this into this whole relationship and this whole cultural approach to the world. And it was, I don't know if you've ever read the book. It's Penelope Walton Rogers, Textiles and Textile Making in Anglo-Saxon England between 400 and some damn thing. So really, that really changed the way I approached Hild. So I hope I get to meet her one day, because I would really like to thank her for that book.
That's so interesting. And I know that my my doctoral advisor is cringing somewhere that I mixed up Old English and Latin. So
just to be really clear, my Latin is awful, just very bad.
It's really hard.
Yeah.
So you know, building on what you just said, I'm really interested in how that intersects with the idea that you know, sexuality and sexual identity functioned so differently in the Middle Ages than it does now. And you know, you are in your writing, I've seen very careful in the way that you apply modern identity terms to pre-modern characters. And I think that's really interesting because it allows us to sort of think about relationships and people and identities outside of the way that we're used to thinking about them. Is that something that you kind of are conscious of, or, you know, attentive to when you are working?
Absolutely. Yes. To me, one of the main things my work does, I mean, if you set aside wanting to please the reader and entertain them and all that stuff, one of the things my work does is to norm the other. Is to center the people who are usually on the margins. So women, queer people, disabled people, people of color, people who are not very privileged, and so on. Remind me of the question again. I'm getting lost. I suddenly was thinking about my dissertation and just going straight down a rabbit hole. Sorry about that.
That's okay. That happens.
Right. Using modern terms and not modern terms about sexuality and sexual orientation. Okay. I wanted to go back and look at the origins of our current discourse about sexuality. And I wanted to look at the influence of the church, the Christian church, on this, and the different kinds of Christian church, the different approaches to Christianity, the way they approached it. And it's always been fairly clear to me that the religions that feel as though they owe a lot to the patristic literature, so to Latin and Greek and Hebrew or Aramaic, I suppose, to a certain extent, they have a particularly patriarchal view of the world. And so when you get this patriarchal view coming to Britain, which was not, I mean, certainly if you look at my understanding anyway, which could be horribly wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected, but my understanding of Celtic British culture was that women, certainly women at higher socioeconomic levels, had a lot more autonomy than women did in the actual Middle Ages. And so I couldn't help but think maybe religion had something to do with this, certainly Christianity. And there's always this confusion, I think, that people have between what is religion and what is culture. And to me, they are so intimately entwined. It's like, how on earth can you separate them out? And so I started trying to imagine how the world would have been just before the priests came. And of course, you know, women have always been less well treated than men. That's just, by always, I mean, certainly in recorded history. Before that, we have no idea. We can make some guesses, but we have no idea. And I would think, well, why would anyone care what women did with and for each other if it didn't impact the economy or succession or any of those male concerns? I mean, most men wouldn't even really think to be jealous of it because women wouldn't matter. So what does it matter if you do with each other? You know, as long as you're not having someone else's baby, who cares? So I kind of began with that perspective. And then I realized that that itself was kind of ridiculous, that people are just people. People will love whoever they love. And that's pretty much how the world's always worked.
Absolutely. That is so interesting. You know, and I see a lot of what you were talking about sort of forms of religion and spirituality, and even just like you know, culture outside of patriarchal structures in Spear. Parator's early childhood is suffused with this sort of half sacred, half mundane relationship with nature and the world around her, with animals and you know, the people she encounters. And I just think that the way that she relates to the world around her is so interesting, in the ways that you've just.
Yeah, I mean, I actually created Peritia the way I did. Okay, I mean, back up even further from that. The hero of my story, Spear, is Peritia, because just the origins of her name make it easier, because it's Welsh, makes it easier to decenter England a little bit from this national origin story. And it brings in the Welsh and maybe the Scottish and so on. But really, the reason I chose Peritia is that the story of Perceval Sir Perceval, is that he was born in a cave and reared apart from the world, just raised by his mother. And to me, that was a fantastic opportunity to create this person who could be really, really, really different and still magnificently self-confident, because she doesn't know that she's not meant to behave that way. She thinks it's perfectly normal. And so I could take this person who is really not like other girls and have her think she's absolutely fantastic, because you need that kind of confidence to do, in fact, what she ends up doing.
I'm glad that you brought up the Welsh setting and the Welsh Arthurian legends that you are playing with here, because I focus on Italian history in my own work, and so I'm familiar with Arthur, but not comprehensively, you know. And I know very little about the Welsh versions of these stories as opposed to the English and the French ones. What do what sets the Welsh versions apart? Is there something different about them that makes their sort of Welsh character evident, or?
I'm not sure it makes the characters different. Actually, yes, I am. It does. So the Welsh stories have a really different mode to them than the English story. I mean, the English stories are 11th century and later. The Welsh stories are much older, and they're very much about Arthur as almost like a genius of place, a spirit of place. So Arthur is associated with particular hills or lakes or woods. And Arthur in these stories has kind of magical nature powers. He's the only one who can go down into the other world and kill the bad witch, or he has this incredible kind of moral authority. Whatever he does is absolutely right and true, and everybody else is bad. And I suspect that Arthur really came not from any kind of real figure, but from possibly some kind of pan-Celtic deity. Or maybe, as I say, these figures of the wood and hill. So in that sense, yeah, the Welsh stories are really different. They're all about nature. And of course, that's what I wanted, because I love writing about nature. I mean, I always get my characters. In fact, I think every single book I've ever written begins with place, and almost always outside, and almost always under the trees. There's a tree right in the first paragraph, I think, of almost every book I've written.
That is fascinating, and it's so true, because even when I was reading Spear through for the first time, I was really struck by the first paragraph, which establishes the setting so vividly, and really very quickly establishes the protagonist, as integrated into her setting. She's really at one with it, I am really interested in the way that this book treats names and naming, and the importance of names. For instance, how Peretier's mother refuses to name her for a long time, and who calls her different names depending on her mood and her inner being. Can you talk a little bit about like names and how they function here?
They function on two levels. One is the writerly level, where I wanted to get names as close as humanly possible, certainly with my level of knowledge anyway, as close as humanly possible to the names of the time. So although Guinevere's pronounced roughly the same as Guinevere, it's actually spelled quite differently. It's clearly a Welsh, or should I say Brittonic name. So but then, and that was just for the kind of authenticity purposes. Just having the right names really helps me be in the right headspace for that. And I think it really puts the reader there too. It's a signal. But from the other perspective, from the story perspective, I could not name Peretier until we were well into the story, for reasons that, I'm sorry to sound so mysterious, that would become clear to anyone who reaches the end. The name is really important. The name is the key to everything. The name is what ties together the legends, the Irish myth of the Tuatha Dé and their four treasures, and the Arthurian legend, and the plot. It's the fulcrum around which everything turns. So it's kind of tricky to figure out how much to say about it. One thing I will say, though, is it was research for the Hilt sequel, Meanwood, that brought me that name. I'd gone down this philological rabbit hole trying to figure out something how to name certain places in Meanwood. And so while I was doing that, I stumbled across a couple of research papers by other people about Welsh names. And I realized that the name Perthea could actually be based on two Welsh words, which is bear and hwdir, which means spear and hard, or so spear enduring, basically. And that was my original title for the book, Spear Enduring. But then my editor said, well, it sounds a bit Viagra-y. I said, well, yeah, and that's part of the joke in the middle of the book, actually, but okay, we'll just call it Spear, whatever. So yeah, the name is super important. It's it about the book.
Oh, that's great. That's so interesting. I am really fascinated by the way in which she relates to her name, because it's something early in the book that she is seeking really intensely, and she's constantly questioning her mother. But then even when she receives the name from her mother, she kind of instantly realizes that that's not enough. She also needs to sort of like go out into the world, and what she actually needs is something that you can only really give yourself. And I just think it's such an interesting, sometimes, the name can be the end goal or something that you arrive at, but here it's like also a starting point as well. And I just thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, she's so young when we begin. I mean, she latches onto this notion of a name because she realizes that everybody else in the whole world has a single name. And she doesn't, and she thinks it's the magic key. If she could just have her name, then she will know who she is. And then, of course, as soon as she gets the name, she realizes that who you are is all about how you are in the world. And she has no idea how she is in the world because she's never been in the world. And so she has to go in the world and find out who she is, what she can do, how the world treats her. Just find her place, really, metaphorically and literally, find her place.
Yeah,
And I think, honestly, that's so much of my favorite fiction, whether I'm talking about the things I have written or the things that I like to read. It's all about people finding out who they are and then growing and changing and learning. And that's one step forward, two steps back, three steps forward, just the mess that life is in that way, but a very joyous way, a non-angsty way.
Yeah, in a way that really suggests, I think, freedom. There is something that's very freeing and almost, I don't know, like a giddy feeling about like being able to claim multiple names and multiple identities, and to have that sense grow over the course of your life and change. That's so much more, it's so much less restrictive than shoehorning yourself into one identity that is going to contain you for your entire life.
Yeah.
When you write about the Middle Ages, you write in a very immersive style, and you really, as a reader, get a sense of the lived experience of medieval life, which is so different from a textbook description of dates and names and events. And I was wondering, for you, what kind of research do you do? You've touched a little bit on that, but I'm particularly wondering, how does your research then interact with your imagination in order to give us this sort of like lived experience of another era?
Well, yeah, it begins with research. So just thinking about, say, textile production, which is such a huge part of the book. I had to learn how to grow and then harvest flax, and then how to process it. And then I'm thinking, so but obviously the information out there is about how people do that in the 20th century and the 21st. And so then I would look at the tools of the 20th and 21st century and go, well, they wouldn't have had this, they wouldn't have had that, they wouldn't have had this here other thing. So what might they have had? And then how long would it take to make that tool that they need to use for this job? And that immediately puts me in the world, like the number of work hours that things take. And so I do all that research, and then I start thinking about the story. And then I use a lot of textile production stuff in Hild as what an actor would call business, stage business. You know, they are scutching the flax as they talk about who someone should marry or not, or a discussion about sex or other things. But it's really authentic stage business, and all the tiny sensory details, like the smell, the feel, the sound of that stuff. Human beings, you know, we have a very, very closely shared vocabulary of emotion. I mean, if you look at our hierarchy of emotional needs, we share those. Over many cultures, there are some basics. We all understand fear, disgust, joy, desire, hunger. These are very basic things that everyone shares. And I think the more you can create those feelings in the reader, give them the smell, the sense, the taste, the feel of the cold metal, the itch of the flax, whatever it is, you can trigger emotions connected to that. And triggering those emotions in a reader is what creates this kind of empathy with the character. And creating that empathy is what really norms the other. Because if you're feeling what this queer woman is feeling, then you kind of understand that, and it becomes your own experience in a particular way. And it makes queer women much less scary if you're straight or if you're not a woman.
That is so interesting to me, and so good to hear. To address, you know, both things you talked about, I had a professor during my undergrad, Penny Johnson was her name, and when she taught about the Middle Ages, she would often sort of ask us to stop and really like put ourselves in the moment. So when we were learning about the mass, for instance, she would ask us to, you know, imagine seeing the priest approach the altar, you know, visually, and to smell the incense in the air and feel the sort of like otherworldly feeling. And that, oh, here she is, my cat's here for the listeners at home. And, you know, I think that is such an interesting way to experience the past, as opposed to just this dry, you know, read about a series of events that happened one after the other. And to your point about establishing empathy for other and characters and queer women, the story just so powerfully, I don't know, invites you on Peretier's journey with her, you know. And I think that I wonder if I could make this point eloquently. Her story sort of like interacts in some really interesting and playful ways with like the traditional hero's journey, and subverting it in some very interesting ways too. And I think that playing with these structures and sometimes outright rejecting them too can also work to sort of like establish your connection to a character, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's for those who are really familiar with all various levels and types of Arthurian legend, Spear is very much a bouquet of Easter eggs. You can be reading it and go, ha ha ha, I know where she's taking that from. But if you know nothing about it, you won't miss anything. This story is its own thing. But I've had lots of people say, oh, and I caught that bit and I thought it was really cool. And then obviously people catch bits that I don't, it's like, really? Who knew? I had no idea. So some of it is unconscious. Some of it is just people guessing a little too hard. But yeah, I mean, there's actually a lot of fairly subtle, some of it not very subtle, humor in Spear. And I love to take serious things because life is serious. I mean, love and death and defending a country, all these things are really serious things, but it doesn't mean that there can't be joy sometimes in very small things, like a bowl of really good stew, or kissing someone for the first time, or watching a priest get drunk and make a bit of a fool of himself. You know, these you can have some fun there, and that's always what I try to create with a story, is a part of life, all the things that make our life a life, the questing, the arriving, the relaxation, the joy, the fear, all those moments. I try to stuff as much in as I can.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, even for a lot of characters in your work, and I think for people moving through the world in real life, that finding joy, when you are a person for whom the world has decided that joy does not belong to you, like finding joy can be an act of resistance in a way,
Oh,
and
absolutely. Yeah,
yeah. Well,
absolutely.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me. One last question. May I ask what's next on the horizon for you? What you're working on, or?
Well, the sequel to Hild, Meanwood, is finished.
Yes.
So that will be out next spring. We don't have an exact date yet because we're still in the one more round of edits to go. But let's say about a year from now. Let's say April or May next year, probably. And meanwhile, right now, obviously, Spear is about to come out, so I'm doing lots of publicity for that. And I have so much more to write about Hild, so I will be researching and writing Hild for a very long time, and I love doing that. I also have some short stories to write about my character Aud, who is the main character of 3 novels, starting with The Blue Place. I would love to publish a short story collection. I've never done that. I think it would be kind of cool. I have loads of essays I'd like to put together and put out in the world. I have a huge kind of sword swinging fantasy / alternate history novel that I want to write, where if you imagine that the fall of Rome coincided with the fall of something nasty from the sky and how it changed civilization, and that would be set in the equivalent today of about the 9th century. So again, back in time, but a really divergent moment. So yeah, so many things I want to do.
Every single one of those things sounds so exciting. And I can't wait to spend more time with Hild, and to, read these other stories. And, you are always welcome back on the show if you ever want to come and talk about anything that comes out in the future. I would
be happy to. Let's make a date for next year then.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, again, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me and to speak with our listeners, and for writing such a beautiful and thought-provoking and moving book. As of April 19th, you can find Spear in your local library or independent bookstore, and it is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.